Pokémon is a massive global success, but how do we get to the world of Pokémon that we know today? From a simple kid who enjoyed bug collecting in video games, to Pokémon wins and waves in 2027, we are going to travel through the history of Pokémon all the way from start to finish. Pokémon is the highest grossing media franchise of all time, and by a lot. They have had an incredible journey over the last 30 years, but without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. And before we do, if you're new, I'm Nintendo Nexus and I'm about to break this all down for you guys, so stick around until the very end. Alright, so for section 1, it all starts with a boy named Satoshi Tajiri, who as a child loved bug collecting. He was very creative and also loved video games. He was born in 1965 in Mashita, Tokyo in Japan, and back then the area was not anything like it was today. It had plenty of lush forests, rice fields, and streams. Satoshi Tajiri obtained the nickname Dr. Bug from his childhood friends because of his obsession with collecting, trading, and studying bugs. Here's a note for Pokémon as a whole. The idea of Pokémon is pulled directly from Tajiri's childhood, which was simply full of exploration, discovering creatures, capturing them, and trading them with friends. That is how Pokémon was born. Another important detail concerning how Pokémon came to be is that during Tajiri's childhood, Japan rapidly urbanized. A core part of Pokémon is Tajiri's nostalgia for collecting and exploring in the forests, which became a foreign concept to urbanized Japanese kids. Tajiri said that Pokémon is a way of preserving that nostalgia just in a digital form. During his teenage years, Tajiri became obsessed with arcade games such as Space Invaders. He became so passionate that he created a self-publishing gaming magazine called Game Freak in the 80s. This very magazine business evolved later into a game development company with the same name. The company was co-founded with illustrator Ken Sugimori, who would go on to design many of the original 151 Pokémon in the first games. Another important part of Pokémon is trading, as we all know. In the early 1990s, Tajiri saw the Game Boy's link cable and thought, what if we could use this cable to make creatures travel between systems? When Satoshi Tajiri pitched this to Nintendo, they didn't quite get the concept. They thought it would be risky. Instead, Tajiri pushed them to allow him to do this, and it was a massive hit when the first games launched. The franchise's core phrase, "Gotta catch 'em all," was built around this very concept. Once approved by Nintendo, the games were underway. Unfortunately, the games didn't have the easiest development. It began in 1990 and lasted 6 whole years. Now you may be wondering, why is that a big issue? Well, remember that back in the 90s, games were way less complex and still 2D, so a 6-year development cycle was almost unheard of. However, this all happened because of funding. During this time, Game Freak nearly went bankrupt. Employees had to work without pay sometimes, and many left due to financial instability. However, Shigeru Miyamoto, the legend himself, came along and personally mentored Tajiri and helped to save the project. He was actually the one who suggested making 2 different games in order to encourage trading. That turned into the iconic games that we know now, Pokémon Red and Green. The designers eventually had to create creatures for their game, which were mostly based off of insects, animals, mythology, and everyday objects. Finally, we come to 1996 when Pokémon Red and Green launched. At first, the sales were modest, but then they exploded. By 1998, the games were released as Red and Blue in North America, and the anime was released and the trading card game as well. The rest is history. Alright, now we come to the next era in Pokemon's history, the Gold and Silver games. These games didn't just simply introduce more Pokemon, they introduced 100 new Pokemon, now totaling the series at 251 completely different Pokemon, a real-time day and night cycle, Pokemon breeding, held items, shiny Pokemon, and a full post-game back in Kanto. I want to emphasize the last one there because a full post-game with more content, specifically the ability to go back to the previous games in a sense was awesome. People loved these games because they felt massive. You could feel it. Not to mention they were revolutionary for handheld RPGs at that time. Many fans still consider Gen 2 the greatest Pokémon sequels ever. Moving on from the games, in 1998, the Pokémon Company was formed. This allowed licensing, merchandising, and brand management. This was a big turning point for the series because Pokémon now wasn't just a franchise, it became a managed global brand. And by 1999 and into 2000, Pokémon was already the highest grossing media franchise in the entire world, and it still is today by a lot. Now we get into 2000 and 2001, where Pokémon started to get some backlash, where the media predicted its death and many parents pushed back on it. Pokémon had to prove its worth, and they definitely did. Alright, so now we enter into Pokemon's debut onto the Game Boy Advance, where Generation 3 begins. After the Pokemania explosion cooled, as mentioned before, people thought Pokemon was done for. But once Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire dropped, everything changed. This was more than simply a graphical upgrade, although that was true. They introduced 135 new Pokemon, bringing the total to 386, a completely new region, Hoenn, double battles, abilities system, natures, improved stat mechanics, weather effects in battle, and many more. But here's what some people found to be controversial. These games weren't backwards compatible with Gold and Silver, which meant that you couldn't transfer old Pokemon forward. That was a shock to people buying the new games. This was the case because the Game Boy Advance hardware used a new system architecture, making direct compatibility difficult. This forced Pokemon to rebuild its internal systems, rethink balance, and modernize competitive mechanics. Now we arrive at 2004, with Fire Red and Leaf Green's debut. These were incredibly historic because they introduced the concept of making remakes, connected the franchise to its roots, and allowed Gen 1 Pokemon to exist in the new engine. This was a well-played move by the company. Pokemon Emerald was also introduced this year, and it refined the previous Ruby and Sapphire games. It introduced the Battle Frontier, much more endgame content, and expanded story elements. The Pokemon Company during this era was well-established enough to also indulge in spin-off games as well, such as Pokemon Colosseum, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Red Rescue Team, and many more, but those were the big ones. An important note for the GBA era, Pokemon wasn't dominating the headlines anymore, but something important was happening. They were stabilizing. The DS was a massive global success, and is currently the second best-selling, Nintendo console of all time. And part of that success was the Pokemon games on the system. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl were the very first ones. These games were again revolutionary for the franchise because they introduced, most importantly, online battling and trading with Wi-Fi, voice chat features, unheard of at the time, touchscreen features, 107 new Pokemon, bringing the total to 493. This was an incredible time for Pokemon fans because it meant that you could battle with anyone around the world whenever possible. This concept also fundamentally changed the Pokemon ecosystem from then on. A huge change that was made during this time was the physical special split, or so it was called, and I'll explain this for you guys. Before Gen 4, whether a move was physical or special depended on its type. For example, all fighting moves were physical and all fire were special. Gen 4 changed this into individual categories for moves. This completely changed the competitive scene, made previously weak Pokemon viable, and created deeper team-building strategy. Moving on to 2008, Pokemon Platinum was released. It refined Pokemon Diamond and Pearl and introduced the Distortion World, faster pacing, Battle Frontier return, expanded Pokédex as well. Oh, and here's a fun fact. This is the only DS Pokemon game that I've ever played all the way through. And I know you guys are all probably like,
What's wrong with you?
why? And yeah, I mean, I get your frustration, I just never got around to the others, but if they ever put these games on Switch 2, I'm definitely gonna play them. I personally love Pokemon Platinum, though, and I played it on my 3DS through backwards compatibility, and I will say that this is one of the most difficult Pokemon games I've ever played, and it was very challenging for me to complete, but I loved it because of that. In 2009 to 2010, moving on, we got more remakes on the DS, Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This marked another huge moment for fans. Some new features included Pokemon Following You, Pokewalker accessory for those of you who remember that, massive post-game in Johto and Kanto, polished sprites, and for many longtime players, this was Pokemon at its most complete stage. It was also during this era that Pokemon started VGC, or Official Video Game Championships. Moving on to Generation 5, which was the Pokemon Black and White era. For these games, Game Freak went radical. For the entire main story, only brand new Pokemon appeared. It was a deliberate soft reboot. Some core features of these games were its deeper story, with a morally complex antagonist, massive mechanical improvements with 156 new Pokemon, hidden abilities, seasonal cycles, and more. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 came out after these, and they expanded the region, added new storylines, increased difficulty, and included a massive post-game. So all around the DS era, I know I just kind of flew through that, but the DS era was an incredible era and a great time to be a Pokemon fan. This is my personal favorite generation, the 3DS generation. I feel like it gets a lot of undeserved hate as well, but that's an irrelevant topic. Pokemon X and Y released in 2013. These games were massive and they introduced 3D to the Pokemon world. This meant that everything went from 2D to being 3-dimensional, which meant that we got the most realistic Pokemon games ever made at the time. This was a massive jump to say the least. Something else cool that happened was that these games released globally on the exact same day. The new features of Generation 6 included Mega Evolution, which recently returned in Legend ZA, Fairy-type Pokemon, player character customization, Sky Battles, Super Training, and much more. After these games, we got some more, you guessed it, remakes. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire launched the next year in 2014. This gave Hoenn full 3D, primal reversions with Primal Groudon and Kyogre, soaring in the sky on Latios or Latios, I love that feature, expanded post-game with the Delta episode, and many more of course. Then we get to Generation 7, which arrived in 2016 to 2019 with Pokemon Sun and Moon. This time, they made another radical move, removing gyms. They replaced gyms with island trials, since this was kind of a tropical region where the games take place. Sun and Moon leaned heavily into the story as well. It was one of the most story-heavy Pokemon games ever. And it's very important to note that these games were criticized quite a bit for their hand-holding, slow pacing, and excessive cutscenes. And in 2017 we got Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon. These are enhanced versions of Sun and Moon, which expanded the story, added Ultra Necrozma, and more post-game stuff to do. And on a personal note, I loved all of these Pokemon games so much, no matter the hate. These games bring back so much nostalgia for me to years ago when I played them, and they will continue to for years. It was also during this generation that we received Pokemon Go. This became a huge cultural phenomenon for many regions throughout the world, and at its peak, millions of people played every single day, public parks were filled with players, and Pokemon returned to mainstream headlines. As we moved to the Switch era, a division arose. Criticism grew around linear routes, smaller post-games, performance limitations, replacing Mega Evolution with new gimmicks, and annualized release cadence. Some fans began feeling like this content depth was shrinking compared to DS era highs. Alright everybody, now we get to the Switch era, arguably the most controversial era in all of Pokemon's history. In 2018 we got Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, and as far as I'm aware these games were not well received by fans. They were reimagined games of Pokemon Yellow and the Kanto games and were designed to bring in Pokemon Go players, simplify mechanics, modernize Kanto into 3D, and however, these games were a technical stepping stone into Game Freak's first mainline entry on Switch, and then Generation 8 launches in 2019, Pokemon Sword and Shield. These were the first true mainline console Pokemon generation games. Now, these games also sparked the biggest controversy in the history of Pokemon. For the first time ever, some Pokemon were not coded into these games. Game Freak cited development resources, model balancing, and animation workload as their reasons. Fans were absolutely furious. The backlash became known as Dexit. This marked a huge shift where Pokemon was no longer universally defended by its fanbase. Sword and Shield introduced a lot of cool open world features though, as well as visible overworld Pokemon, dynamic weather zones, max raid battles, and Dynamax and Gigantamax mechanics. And a while after these games, Game Freak permanently ended a third game being announced, or an enhanced version, as seen with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, with adding DLC. We then get to 2021, where Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were introduced. These were developed by a different company rather than Game Freak, and were infamous for not being received well by fans. Many people expected deeper modernization with these remakes, and the games didn't hit the mark. In 2022, Pokemon Legends Arceus, the first major spin-off game, was introduced. This was the boldest shakeup since Gen 5, and included real-time catching, seamless battle transitions, semi-open zones, crafting system, ancient Sinnoh setting, and many more things. Also in 2022, we received Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which made the jump to being fully open world after Pokemon tested the waters with this in Legends Arceus. I think we all know about how these games were received, but basically if you aren't familiar, they lacked polish big time. They lacked in many ways, honestly, but graphically was a big area. The games were full of frame rate issues, glitches, and more. They also had other things, but I won't talk about it all here because of how recent these games are. So essentially, Scarlet and Violet were arguably some of the worst Pokemon games ever made, even despite being Generation 9. And yeah, so Pokemon's not doing too hot coming off of those. Alright everyone, and finally, we get to the moment you all have been waiting for. Pokemon Winds and Waves for the future of Pokemon. Pokemon Pokopia also launches, it actually launches at the time of recording today. And at the time, this looks absolutely awesome. Everyone's praising it. And of course, Pokemon Generation 10 Pokemon Winds and Waves launches on Switch 2 next year. And here's what I'll say about these games. If they don't get these right, it will further damage the company and break trust with fans, but I'm personally am very hopeful that they'll get it right. So here's to hoping that these games will be the best yet. So that's going to do it for this video. Alright everybody, well that's going to do it for this video. Comment down below what you guys think about the history of Pokemon, what's your favorite generation, all that kind of stuff. I would love to hear your thoughts. And make sure to subscribe before you head out if you like. And also leave a like if you want as well. Maybe even hype the video. And I will see you guys in the next one. See ya!